OJ Rose, and today we're going to be talking about a paper called The Blank Canvas, and we're going to go through it section by section. And section 1 asks us to imagine that we wake up on a blank canvas. There's whiteness for as far as we can see. There is no ground, no sky, nothing. There's a real sense in which we're not even on a blank canvas. So we're just in this kind of void with this floating consciousness. And this is the question. What would be something rational to do right now? So we're floating in this space on this what I call a blank canvas, and the question is, what would be rational to do? Well, the argument I'd like to submit to you is that we can't be rational right now. There has to be something there for us to determine the rational. If there's nothing, then there's no way to determine what would be rational. But let's say suddenly I gain a stomach, and I gain a body. Well, now it's rational to eat because I have a stomach and a stomach has to be fed. Maybe it's even rational to use my hands or to lift my hands because they feel tired. There's a pain running through them and I rub it. So the moment I gain a body, I can start thinking about what constitutes the rational. But that means there had to be truth, a fact. I have a body. Not that truth and fact can always be used as similes, but generally we can think of gaining a body as gaining the facticity of having a body. Now I can start to determine what is rational. But notice a few things that's kind of interesting. Once I gain a stomach, I can get hungry. So I've gained the ability to determine the rational, but it has also arisen thanks to a corresponding lack or like a kind of problem, which is kind of weird because I gain actuality, but in gaining actuality, I can gain a problem. And there's a sense in which whenever we gain actuality, we gain a corresponding lack. So, I gain the stomach, so now it's possible for me to get hungry. But let's say a red car were to appear. Well, I gain a red car, but now I'm lacking the possibility of a yellow car. Let's say I gain this body, but now I've lost the ability to gain wings. I can't fly. So in the state of nothingness, I was totally free, in a sense. Anything was possible, and yet nothing was actual, because the freest thing of all is nothingness. So when I was on that blank canvas, I couldn't be rational, but I had total freedom. To gain the ability to be rational, I had to lose freedom. Potential had to be actualized. Potential had to be lost. So instead of maybe the language of the difference between actuality and total freedom, it seems like I had to lose potential in order to gain freedom. Because if no potential was realized, there would be nothingness, and so nothing would be there to be free. This would suggest that it's very problematic that we often use potential and freedom as similes, or we tend to think that we have more freedom where we have more potential. Because it really seems to be the case that I can't have freedom unless I lose potential, unless something is actualized and realized. But strange enough, that would mean that when I gain freedom, it will come with a feeling of losing it. When I gain a body that can be free, I lose the ability to fly in this example. So it would seem that all gaining of freedom comes with a feeling of losing freedom. And this might suggest why it's so hard for us to prove or believe that we have freedom, because it always arises with a corresponding feeling of a restriction on it. Whenever we gain freedom, we also gain a feeling that freedom is bound. Also, though, this would suggest that it's impossible for me to be rational where I have total potential, where anything is possible. In order for rational action to occur, it has to be the case that not everything is possible, because if everything was possible, that would mean there's nothingness, and there would be no sources of information by which I could determine what is rational. Also, do note with the hunger example, that would suggest that I can often determine rationality relative to a lack or a kind of negative, a kind of I need to eat. I have a body that will die if I don't eat, therefore it is rational to go eat something. So in this way, rationality arises precisely in circumstances where it almost seems restricted, where it almost seems bound, where it kind of doesn't even seem itself because it's just operating according to parameters that it's stuck in. And yet if there was, and we often associate rationality with freedom, which we should, because in choice, right, you can be rational, you can choose, you can be free, which we should, because you can't have rationality where there is nothingness. But do note if indeed all actualization of potential, all choice gives rise to a binding, gives rise to a loss of potential, then where there is rationality, there is less potential. And so there is arguably less possible choice, which would seem that there would be less opportunities to exercise rationality. I think this kind of paradoxical situation is really important to note, because if we don't understand it, then we're going to really struggle to have any belief that we have freedom or that we have free will. Because it's going to exist in this kind of dichotomy where we think losses of potential are losses of freedom. But that's the incorrect relationship. In fact, we have to trade potential to gain actuality, and without actuality, we cannot have freedom. So we have to trade potential for freedom. If we think of potential and freedom as always going together, then whenever there's actuality that makes possible an increase of freedom, since that actuality is going to necessarily give rise to a feeling of losing potential, then we're going to take the very experience in which we gain the possibility of freedom as evidence that we don't have freedom, and that's going to set us up to misunderstand our situation. To close section 1, it should be noted that I think the blank canvas experiment also shows that David Hume is correct, that there's no such thing as autonomous rationality, that it's impossible for us to be rational all the way down, because in order to be rational, there has to be a truth ahead of time. I talked throughout the series about the difference. The true isn't the rational, that you need the true first to determine what is rational. And in this example, we can simply see that we cannot be rational unless there are pre-existing sources of information relative to which we can determine the rational. So this thought experiment can also help us understand why David Hume is correct in his thinking. Section 2 is going to start talking about the aesthetic. And the word aesthetic, we can associate with a blank canvas, and basically we can say that a canvas that doesn't have anything aesthetic on it, no painting, is a canvas on which we can't determine the rational, and also a canvas on which nothing can be free. Something has to be painted there in order for freedom to be possible, but of course the moment I draw a line, I've created a restriction. And the aesthetic is going to be associated with experience, with action, with perception, with art, and so on and so forth. But the paper will later make an important distinction between aesthetic and art, where all art is aesthetic, but not all aesthetic is art. Now, this is a distinction I can't promise I maintain throughout all my work, but it will be important here. If the aesthetic is the experiential, and we go back to what we were saying, where the truth has to come before the rational. And if we associate the rational with philosophy, considering that philosophy is about thinking, generally, logic, rationality, so on and so forth, I think is legitimate. And if we consider the experiential, and what do we experience in life? We experience shapes, we experience colors, we experience phenomenon that has sounds, and so on and so forth. So experience is very aesthetic. I don't really ever experience anything in non-aesthetic terms, without shape, without color. Frankly, all information in my experience is aesthetic. Even if we're talking math problems on a piece of paper, that's visual. I see the math problem on the piece of paper. And so at least for my world, maybe somehow there are parts of the universe that relative to itself entails information that isn't aesthetic at all. But at least for me, my world is an aesthetic experience. Information is always aesthetic. Well, this would suggest that the aesthetic has to come before philosophy, that I have to have truth based on experience and what I see around me, what I perceive, in order to determine the rational. So the aesthetic determines the horizons of philosophy. The true determines the horizons of the rational. And without the aesthetic, which we can also associate with the sensual, with things that my senses can take in. Without that, then I cannot determine the rational. Now, this being the case, we can say that I determine the rational relative to three modes of truth, kind of like what we think is true, what is true in terms of the material universe, so what I centrally experience, and what could be true. And this last space is one that art will occupy. So rationality is always shaped by my idea of the true, what I think is true. And certainly all three of those categories could ultimately fall under the category of what I think is true, because even the facticity of the material framework of the material world is within a framework that is based on ideas of mine. So if I understand that bookcase over there as a bookcase, well, that understanding of a material reality is already situated within ideas. So arguably, all truth is what I think is true. That's fair enough. But it does seem to be that the experience of the bookcase, it's something I can touch, something I can feel, is different than, say, the thought of a unicorn that I can never experience, at least as a unicorn. Of course, I experience a horse, I experience a horn, and I put them together in my mind, but I can't experience directly a unicorn. And so there does seem to be something different about the sensual experience of the bookcase, even if I give it understanding and meaning within some sort of conceptual framework. So anyway, it's important to note the bookcase is aesthetic. It has shape, it has colors, and that aesthetic information of the bookcase determines what I think is rational. And I can see the bookcase has glass, so it is rational not to throw a baseball at it. It is rational to expect there to be books on that bookcase. Based on what I see of the bookcase, that determines what is the rational way to relate to the bookcase. Therefore, the aesthetic, the experiential, the phenomenological, and so on determines the horizons of the rational. A blank canvas is entirely devoid of aesthetics, which means it is devoid of any truth. As a result, I cannot be rational or free, for I cannot choose. I can only be random, maybe. The fate of aesthetics is the fate of us. Aesthetics make logic, thinking, philosophy, and the like possible. So aesthetics provide information without which rationality cannot determine itself. The colors, shape, design of this bookcase provides me with information according to which I can determine what is rational. And rationality needs sources of information outside of itself to be itself. Otherwise, it's just a thought. And all sources of information are ultimately aesthetic. Rationality cannot provide information for itself. Again, take the blank canvas. There's nothing for me to think about. There's no source. So I can't make any meaningful difference. Maybe I can move my head as that floating consciousness, or move my eyesight or something. It's hard to even imagine that. But if I could, it would be random. It would be hard to think of it as a free choice or a choice at all, or let alone rational. It would be random. Whatever occurred on that blank canvas would be random, and randomness is not freedom. It's just whatever comes to pass, whatever is the case. It has nothing more to it. So wherever there is understanding, aesthetics are present, because all information must be experienced aesthetically. Where aesthetics are lacking, freedom and rationality decline, and randomness spreads, if we consider randomness as I'm so discussing. So where there are no aesthetics, there's going to be less freedom, and there's going to be less rationality. The relation of philosophy and aesthetics is like a machine that must all work together to work at all. And I think that's important to understand, is because I'm not trying to say aesthetics is more important than philosophy, because if you had, say, the bookcase, the experience of the bookcase, but you had no rationality, it would be meaningless to you. It would be chaotic. It would just be this random impression of shapes and colors that you couldn't understand. Yes, aesthetics, which we associate with the true, has to come first, but just because it has to come first does not mean it's necessarily better. In the same way that I have to have axles on a car to make the car move, but I also need tires. The fact that there's an order that the car is put together does not mean that the parts that come first are necessarily better than the parts that come later. In a similar way, it can sound like I'm saying it's fair enough to associate the aesthetic with the foundation of a house. But if you had a house that had a foundation, but it had no furnishings and it was empty, the house would not be a home. I mean, take like a haunted house, or people associate a house that's a haunted house. Maybe it's totally together. Maybe the foundation is great, but no one wants to live there because of the atmosphere, because of it feels creepy. So just because you have a good foundation, you also have to. Just because a house has a foundation doesn't mean it's a home. But similarly, if you have a really nice home but the foundation is falling apart, then it's going to collapse. So I think it's important to understand that although aesthetics determines the horizons of philosophy, philosophy and aesthetics need to work together, and ultimately this will mean they have to work dialectically together, because basically dialectics is critical if there's going to be real critical thinking. So we've tended to associate aesthetics and thinking as opposed to one another. We tend to think of art and philosophy as opposed to one another, or literature today tries very intentionally to avoid being philosophical, and philosophers often despise literary philosophers and things like that. But basically, we're arguing here that there is a necessary relationship between aesthetics and philosophy and thinking in general, where they do not relate. They both fail. They both fall apart. So the aesthetics and the philosophical, the artistic and the thoughtful, they need to relate to one another to be possible at all. This is the end of part 1 of the blank canvas, sections 1 through 2. Part 2 will cover sections 3 through 6. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.